to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen, and today we're talking, as we usually do, to somebody who's deeply involved in research around media, in this case new media, or what is now called internet studies or social media. We'll maybe work out that as we progress, and in keeping with the past programs, we'll look at the range of issues that emerge in the work that our guest has been doing. So firstly, welcome to Andre Brock, who's visiting the Microsoft Research Center from the University of Michigan.
Yes.
Welcome, Andre.
Thank you for having me.
No, you're welcome. And we're going to talk about a range of concerns, issues and ideas associated with how what we say African Americans, minority communities are using social media, internet-based media, and the kinds of challenges that there are as a researcher, and the opportunities that there are that have appeared, and perhaps some of the questions, many of them, that we still need to ask.
Okay.
So let's start with the work that you have done and published, which I'll mention by name, which is from the Black Hand side, Twitter as a cultural conversation. This is a fascinating and exciting piece of work that seems to me to address the key questions that we really don't know enough about how people in quite specific communities use Twitter or use social media, but also then more specifically how African Americans or black people use it, and the connection to something that's been important to me and to many people in cultural media studies, which is the connection between the use of that media form and culture, how people live. So what's the basic premise of this from the Black Hand side of the article?
So the intent of the article was to make a connection between the types of technology that people use and the offline identities that they bring to them in order to use them. And so it was born out of my frustration with digital divide research, where I was constantly confused because of the ways in which African Americans were perceived as not being digitally adequate or able to use the internet. And so Black Twitter ended up being a really helpful use case to demonstrate that blackness did indeed have a place on the internet and was proficient in ways that were unexpected. And so primarily, I guess the 25-second elevator pitch would be, I found that the ways in which black people speak themselves into being through discourse worked really well with the ways that Twitter allows users to express themselves online.
Does that mean that there's a different way of interacting within the black community, within black culture, that we haven't paid enough attention to?
It's possible, although there has been some negative attention paid to the phase when the American education system was going through its concerns with Ebonics or African American vernacular, right? So they were concerned, a lot of educators and black parents were concerned that the ways in which black people spoke in their native home situations was in ways detrimental to them being successful in the wider society. And you saw some of that when Black Twitter was first introduced. There were people who were concerned that it was just the everyday banter and playfulness of black people as opposed to something that was more suitable to electronic discourse.
Right. And when you talk about electronic discourse, and maybe we'll get back to that earlier point in a minute, but when you talk about electronic discourse, you talk about Twitter as a multi-platform form of access, or a multi-platform internet application. Tell us how that works. What exactly is the multi-platform, just so that everybody's clear on what you're thinking about?
So my colleague Tarleton Gillespie would probably be much better at talking about platforms than I am, but the way I envisioned it was that Twitter works as a service, and so a service should be accessible to users across any number of devices, networks, locations, and even connectivities, right? And so when I argue for Twitter as a multi-platform, I mean that it can be accessed using a smartphone, a dumb phone, your browser, your tablet, any number of devices, and regardless of how you're communicating with the internet, so whether it's cellular or Wi-Fi or Ethernet.
Right, and it also offers pretty much anything that you can make digitally: audio, video, text. You know, it really sort of scrambles things up, the sort of connectivity that it offers to other resources. That's what I find fascinating about it, things that I wouldn't otherwise know about.
Right.
suddenly I know about.
Especially in its current incarnation. I think the CEO is now trying to convince the world that Twitter should be a news platform, while at the same time his board of directors is trying to promote Twitter as a place for streaming video and audio. And so the fact that both of those things can coexist within the same network really speaks to the way that Twitter has managed to merge a lot of different formerly separate media streams into one space, plus the added aspect of interactivity.
Right. And of course, I think it was Dennis McQuail made the point that the key feature of the internet was its interactivity. We could talk not only back to the source, but we could talk to each other horizontally.
Yes.
Is that something that's particularly unique, or that you believe is maybe unique to the way African American or black communities make use of Twitter?
There's a computer scientist named Brendan Meter who had studied how the ways in which Twitter's sociality works, and he found, and this was a few years ago, but I'm pretty sure it hasn't changed, he found that African Americans tended to use Twitter as if it was a chat service, so they tended to have roughly equal numbers of people they followed and equal numbers of people that were following them. And this is very different from the ways in which many other people use Twitter, where celebrities will have 1 million or 20 million followers, but only themselves follow 100 or 200 people, right? So for celebrities, it acts as a broadcast platform. For fandom, it acts as a way to connect with people, but there's very rarely any intercourse. And African Americans kind of sit squarely in the middle, where they're as interested in talking to the people that follow them as they are the people that follow them are interested in listening to them. And this maps really well onto the idea of black discourse as a communitarian type of discourse, where the community is interested in promoting itself as a unit, as a space with a shared political aim. And so Twitter worked really well to facilitate that with both with the sociality and with the near real-time response rate. So it's almost like having a conversation with someone who is next to you, right? While the internet has long been promoted as a space for interactivity, I think that interactivity really never was as well on display until Twitter showed up. Right, so I've studied blogs, I've looked at social networking services, and many of them implemented chat services or commenting platforms to allow for a measure of interactivity, but Twitter is one of those spaces where it really became obvious that people like to talk to one another. Right?
That's great. And speaking strictly for myself, as somebody who has worked around questions of intercultural communication, the notions of community and collectivity, which is a category within intercultural communication, has struggled in the United States in particular. And you use this notion of the racial artifact. And in a sense, what Twitter operates as a racial artifact is as you say, a communitarian or a tool that reinforces collectivity. Would that be reasonable kind of claim, or is it going too far? For the most part,
but then one of the questions I would get asked is, how does that work for other people? Arab Spring has been brought up as an example of collectivities becoming internet communities. But in much less, I think Twitter also works in a much more alienating, scattered way, where it doesn't necessarily promote collectivities that are recognizable as communities in a real world sense. But they do represent shared interest topics. So I'm sure that all the fans of Justin Bieber could pack several stadiums, right? But when they come together online on Twitter, they are then known as the Beliebers, and they have a collective force and a collective voice that tends to overwhelm pretty much what anybody else would say if Twitter allowed them to, right? And so that idea of collectivity, I think, is a really important one. I like it actually better than community, because it speaks to the fact that it's heterogeneous, right, made up of many separate parts, but they're all kind of working in concert to promote a particular topic or idea.
Right, and we're I think, at a point now where we're seeing this notion of electronic collectivity through Twitter finding its moment in things like Black Lives Matter, and potentially in other movements where maybe not progressive movements either, but where people are seeing that they have a shared sense of what their culture and their interests, and Twitter is facilitating that integration.
In part because I think Twitter allows for direct address and response in ways that other electronic services have not. So a really well, it's an egregious example, but there was a campaign called Gamergate a few years ago.
Remember
where,
it, yes.
Where gamers were particularly incensed at the intrusion of what they felt were feminist and critical race values into their sacred gaming spaces. And so they used Twitter in many ways to try to harass people with those proponents that were proposing that feminism and critical race be part of the gaming world, and used it very effectively. They created fake accounts. They even went so far as to emulate by assuming the discourses of what they consider to be African American social justice warriors, right? So Twitter allows that type of thing, which is one of the things that's coming under fire for the fact that it allows for racist and offensive speech, bigoted, misogynist speech to be promoted as easily as it does the type of political action that Black Lives Matter. But I think without one, you couldn't necessarily have the other. It's not really an argument for free speech. I don't think anybody should be free to insult or defame or harm anyone. But without that liminal space in which to create discourse, you don't necessarily get the same types of freedoms to create the political activity that we're talking about.
Right. One of the guests from quite a while ago on Boston Media Theory, whose name is Nina Hunterman,
Yes.
and she's also based at Suffolk University, I believe, talked a little bit about Gamergate and the challenges. And I think it's pretty clear that ultimately we have to talk about politics.
Yes.
We have to talk about the way that politics defined simply as claims and competition over power has been reorientated through something like Twitter.
Agreed.
Yeah, and it may be, and probably is much wider than Twitter,
Yes.
but certainly in your case, and that's your field of focus, the way that it's no longer, pardon me, possible for those with authority simply to assume that what they say is taken when it appears in the media.
Right. I think some of our local and national politicians have found that out, much to their dismay. But also it's interesting the ways that Twitter and its ancillary services like Periscope and Facebook live streaming have influenced the way that politicians themselves engage with the public. So when the Congressional Black Caucus and some other people were broadcasting from the floor of Congress to talk about the ways in which they were opposing certain types of Republican bills. I think that's a fascinating way to understand how politics makes its way into the digital realm and they influence one another.
Well, not only exactly, but not only that level of politics. I mean, also if you like, the politics of everyday life, in the sense in which the activism, the social movements that are now emerging, not so much because there's a form of resistance within the black community to oppression,
Agreed.
but because there's a tool with which they can announce their resistance to that oppression.
Agreed.
And that's a major and significant shift.
Right.
So while on one hand you have, yes, what happens in Washington is fascinating, we can watch what happens in Congress through Periscope and live streaming, we can also see that on the streets people are organising in very different ways.
Agreed. One of the interesting parts about Twitter, I talked about it a little bit in my article and other researchers have covered it as well, is the ways in which the hashtag makes Black Twitter activity visible. In many ways, without the hashtag, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see what the individual networks of Twitter users are writing about because there's no real topical coherence. They're writing to each other. They share perhaps certain values that they can articulate easily, but the hashtag allows for Twitter itself to pick up that activity and broadcast it to the world. And so a couple of colleagues of mine, Dean Freeland, Charlton McElwain, and Meredith Clark, recently did a white paper, and they looked at the ways in which Twitter informed political stuff, but also voiced the politics of the everyday. And they found that there were many different groups of people contributing to Black Twitter and Black Lives Matter. There were young people, there were people of queer people, there were older folk, there were church folk, and they were all contributing in their various ways to this gestalt that we call Black Twitter.
It's also got something to do with what in a larger media studies field is referred to as the politics of representation. What happens, in your view, when blacks start to represent themselves as themselves?
I'm actually trying to figure that out myself right now. Part of it, and the ways in which I argue for how we understand technology, when blacks start to argue for themselves, it contravenes civil discourses and human discourses. And when you add an additional layer of technological skill to it, it also contravenes technological discourse as well. So when Black Twitter first came to prominence, people, again, confused it, argued for it as not really understanding what Twitter was about, not really understanding what digital practice was about. It was just gameplay. And Black Twitter really only gained respect when it was perceived to have achieved some productive goals, such as powering Black Lives Matter, right? That is an interesting goal, and it's an important goal, but I'm kind of, I think where you're sitting, when I talk about the politics of representation, I'm not so much worried or interested in what Black Lives Matter is doing as I am in what the everyday people are how they're constituting how they're constituting themselves online in different spaces. So the young folk who are concerned with what the latest dance is, the older folk who are concerned with how people conduct themselves in public, right? And so many other things that are part of everyday life. That part makes it to Twitter, and that's the actual part that I think powers the larger political movements.
Okay, so that's moving, if you like, translating what happens at a micro-political level through the vehicle of Twitter, not for itself, but then to a larger social movement or a connection with others.
I think Twitter's role and where it allows for those voices to become visible allows for the movement into a political space. I guess I should say a civic space, because it's always political. The personal is political, right? But people being able to express their frustrations with everyday life in a space which allows them to do so, such as Twitter, right, then allows for activists and other folk who are concerned about political processes to engage that energy and move it on to political spaces, if that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense, and also raises wonderful questions for what we might think of as democracy. Clearly, if we were to put on our political theory thinking caps, or whatever we put on these days, we would have to say that Black Twitter, or Twitter generally, or even social media and the internet raises all sorts of questions about the existing and clearly not very effective model of representative democracy as it's practiced in this country. Twitter seems to me to be much more reflective of a form of direct democracy. Certainly from the organisational perspective, you can tweet me, and we can tweet whoever else we're hashtagging, and all of a sudden you've got either a flash mob or you've got a movement. That seems to me to be pretty dramatic.
It does.
And I was thinking while you were talking also about how the use of what you refer to as the techno-cultural shifts, and we can talk about that theory a little later, how it seems to me maybe to represent another great moment in the way Black Americans can claim and assert themselves within the larger civil society, and also much more than move the conversation forward. That's a very tiresome phrase, but move their own interests forward. And I was thinking, what would be the equivalent? What did Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and Malcolm X and those brothers do? What did they achieve? What technologies did they have? They had public speaking and rhetoric. But before that, I was thinking, well, what else was there? Well, there was singing, and there were the songs of the slave community, but there've been pretty big gaps between those movements.
Yes, but I would also ask you to consider the ways in which the bawdy blues, the down south blues, right, the juke joints and the jazz the ways in which more embodied forms, not necessarily respectable forms of expression of both sensuality and pathos, right, and pain, also inform the ways people understood themselves, right? So when you're allowed to have a voice, you don't necessarily just voice your desire to vote, you also voice your desire to live a life like anyone else, right? And so I think if I could argue for an ultimate goal, I think the ultimate goal for Blacks would be not have to be burdened with the idea of representing their best selves at every point. It would just be the freedom to be themselves, right? And Twitter has allowed that in ways, and made that visible in ways that other social networks have not done.
And I love that phrase that you use, live a life like everybody else. I mean, what a simple yet profound insight into what amounts to a claim for emancipation from oppression. It's not. It's important to me to not say, well, what we're going to achieve with Twitter is is everybody will live in a McMansion,
Right.
Or everybody will have a fortune and be a celebrity. I mean, that fantasy, that myth, has to be addressed. And it seems to me that just making a simple but astute and profound claim like living a life like everybody else means an enormous amount still in this society.
Yes.
And so let's go back to this techno-cultural theory.
Okay.
What's the intersection? How do you see this intersection? We started with this. Let's explore that a little, between the relationship between technology and culture.
So I am in love with what Clifford Christian calls the triadic theory of media, where I think that there are always three parts to any particular media object: the object itself, the industries and practices that surround it, and then my favorite part is the beliefs that people have while they're using the object. And so for my classes, I talk about hammers, right? Because kids, I think they still understand hammers, and the idea that when the old saw, when you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail, says a lot more about what you believe to be possible than what the hammer actually does, right? And so social media has its own set. I'm sorry, not social media. Information technologies have their own set of beliefs about what can and cannot be done with them. And a lot of them revolve around capitalist and neoliberal aims, so productivity, efficiency, command, and control, right? But also some things that you wouldn't necessarily assume to be part of it, such as masculinity, religion, and whiteness. Right, and so for me, technoculture is a valuable way to look at technologies, because it not only accepts that there are functional properties to any particular set of technology, but there are also spiritual and cultural properties to it as well. Right, so the idea that we can have a culture of programmers, right, where these are young men who have gone to elite schools and have MBAs or advanced computer science degrees and are very technically capable, but still in a certain sense, they are very much tied to this cult of masculinity, and it informs the way in which they run their companies, in the ways in which Silicon Valley thinks of technological products being developed, right, and even in the ways that they tend to hire and not hire certain people of color, women, and older folk. And so that is part and parcel. You can't separate that culture out from what the technology does.
Right. Wow. Fantastic. And so the point at which this becomes a kind of intervention into education is simply to make the point that the programmers. So again, I would imagine it would be not only elite schools, but mostly white, privileged folk have really structured the culture within Twitter.
Yes.
And your work seems to me to say, well, actually no. And you make the point in this article, which we started with, from the Black Hand Side, Twitter as a Cultural Conversation, that Black Americans equal a quarter of Twitter users. Is that still the case, or is it more now?
It's actually equalized a bit, so it's 27%, and this is Pew Internet's survey from, I think, late last year. So 27% African American, 23% Hispanic, and 45 to 50% white, which reflects a lot of the North American audience as well, right? But it's still pretty heavily skewed towards Black internet users, because I think Pew's statistics were 2 out of 10 blacks are Twitter users, right? And you can't necessarily make those same claims for white Twitter users, right? And so they dominate in numbers. And thanks to the affordances of the hashtag and Twitter sociality, they also can dominate in the ways in which they get attention on the network, right? And so you'll see moments where hashtags that are particularly tied to Black culture or Black interests become the trending topics of the day, right? Overtaking whatever pop star is happening, whatever musical event is happening, whatever sporting event is happening. On the everyday, right? There are days when the Super Bowl is the #1 or the World Cup is the #1, but there are many more days. For instance, last year, there was a hashtag called Thanksgiving with Black Families, right? And it was not specifically a criticism of the ways in which Thanksgiving works overall, but the ways in which Black people celebrate Thanksgiving and the types of things that come along with it on an everyday basis.
Great. Well, that's wonderful to hear. And it seems to me that the point around which culture is defined, at least in part, as the way people live, that can then be celebrated within those people and the way they live. Yes. The ordinariness of it, but shared ordinariness of it seems to me to be a wonderful thing. So let's talk finally. We've got about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
We can't do the topic justice, but here I have a nice article called Alicia Garza on the Beauty and Burden of Black Lives Matter.
Mm.
And she makes the point from The Guardian of September 2016, she makes the point that there's been a wonderful facilitation of this social movement of Black Lives Matter through Twitter and through technology, but that's not the only point.
Yes.
You make a similar point, do
Yes.
you not?
Yes, particularly for Garza and the Black Lives Matter activists, what I find incredibly fascinating and valuable about them is that Twitter was not their object, and that it is a means for disseminating their cause and gathering further attention to their cause, but it's not the only reason or space where they exist, right? So the fact that there are Black Lives Matter chapters, right, that also happen to use Twitter is incredibly important to me, because one of my arguments is that people bring their offline existences to bear on what their online existence is, right? It brings, for Twitter, it brings conversational and topical coherence, right? So you understand what certain people are about based on what they're interested in. Black Lives Matter has managed to capture American attention valuably, right, importantly in the last few years, in part because they managed to pick up on Twitter at a time when its emotional impact was starting to be noticed by the white mainstream American press, right? So picking up Black Lives Matter at the same time when the Ferguson protests were going on, which also were showcased on Instagram and Facebook, but did not have the same impact, right? When Trayvon Martin was going on, which somewhat predates that, and the ways in which the protests continued to gain steam as the trial was progressing, Black Lives Matter managed to tap into a space that allowed for the emotional expression of catharsis, which happens to be Twitter, right? In ways that are also, that can be broadcast to a wide audience, both in-group and out-group, and make themselves heard. I think I answered your question.
Well, I think, yeah, well, you did in the sense in which also, you know, it's not only about a bounded or self-contained
Yes.
world in which messages are going around and around,
Right.
as it were, without connecting to the ordinariness
Right.
of life, to the struggle and to organising that struggle.
Right. In previous instances, those types of conversations would have been had in barbershops, in black churches, in beauty salons, in places where black people congregated but didn't necessarily have access to the public sphere. And Twitter, those same conversations are going on that were once held in enclaves, but now are accessible to many more people who would not normally have had the attention. So one of the more interesting developments out of this is now the idea that Black Lives Matter should be juxtaposed against All Lives Matter, right? And the ways in which Black Lives Matter has illustrated that Black lives are important too, and not necessarily taking away from All Lives Matter, but managing to suggest that this is something we should pay attention to.
Okay, and I'm sure we will continue to pay attention to it, and certainly your work and your research will make a wonderful contribution and continue to do so. So, Andre, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for being here. It's been a great conversation and very useful to me in particular, and I'm sure to many of our watchers and viewers who will be fascinated and excited to know what's happening in Twitter and the social media space. So that's it for now. Until next time, this is Marcus Breen and Boston Media Theory saying thanks and good night and goodbye.